Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Aaron Smith. I'm the CEO of EEBA. I'm joined by Nancy Bakeman, our Executive Vice President. And we're really proud today, as part of our EEBA webinar podcast series, to have David Bernardino from Ammunition. Ammunition is a marketing firm. David, you're on the East Coast, right?
That's correct.
Up by New York. We'll get to
New Jersey. The rest of my team's in Atlanta, actually.
Yeah, New Jersey, Atlanta, the tri-state area.
Exactly.
Yeah. And today he's going to discuss competitive differentiation for growth. So David, great to see you as always, and welcome.
Appreciate it, Aaron and Nancy. Great to be back speaking with the EEBA folks here. So looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, and David, if people have questions for David, just put them in the Q&A section and I will serve those up to David as we go through today's presentation. We will have some time at the end for questions as well. So David, take it away.
Awesome. So like Aaron said, competitive differentiation for growth is what we're going to talk about today. And so let's go through what we're going to talk about. We probably won't need the full hour, which is good. I'm always about brevity here. But here's what we're going to talk about. First, an introduction and learning objectives. Then we'll talk about why is this important? Because people always ask, why are we here? And I always want to address that question. Thirdly, we'll talk about how to assess, and then how do you apply the insights is at the tail end. And as Aaron said, we'll have time for Q&A. So without further ado, let's dig in. So introduction and learning objectives. Introduction, again, I'm David Bernardino. I'm the Chief Client Officer at Ammunition, and we're a marketing services firm that was founded to lead complex brands and complex marketplaces, do a lot of work in the building industry, and you can see by the clients that we have on the screen. So that's a little bit about who we are. Again, if you want to nerd about stuff, I'll make sure that my contact info is present at the end of the session. So what are we trying to achieve over the next few minutes? First, wanted to talk about the role of competitive differentiation in the marketing mix and understanding why this is critical. Second, give you a little overview of some of the tools and techniques to assess your brands versus competitors. Again, this is not going to be exhaustive, but at least this will serve as some food for thought as you're thinking about how to position yourself vis-a-vis competitors. And then lastly, talk about some techniques on how to apply them to your current situation. So let's get started with why this is important. And when I always have these conversations, I always like to start with definitions. And this was a definition that I found on a website, and I thought it was actually pretty interesting. If you think about it, competitive differentiation is a positioning tactic that can undertake to set products and services and brands apart from from its competitors. Right? It's about trying to carve out a space that is unique to your own. Take it one step further. It is a critical element to any marketing strategy. And if you think of the key elements of a marketing strategy, there are typically three key elements. First is where to play. Trying to define who you're going after, what marketplace are you trying to attack, right? And clearly you want to understand, how you would stack up versus your competitors when trying to answer that question. Second question being how to win, right? How are you going to win in the places where you choose to market yourselves? Again, competitive differentiation is going to be pretty critical here. And then the third question, which often is not asked, but I think is probably the most critical question, is what's your right to win in those marketplaces? Again, trying to differentiate yourself competitively speaking is super important. And if you think about it, competitive differentiation is everywhere. It's almost ubiquitous. And so we're going to go through a little bit of show and tell to prove this point. And the first one is a campaign that you probably remember back if you're a person of a certain age. For those who remember, this is the classic Apple ad from the early 2000s. And on the left, had a guy that represented PCs. And the guy on the right was the representation of Apple. And if you think about it at the time, Apple was the challenger brand going after Microsoft and IBM and Gateway and Dell and the dominant PC market. And if you think about how things were back then, Apple was sort of the be all end all for artists and educators. It was sort of a niche product, whereas PCs were very much, used by businesses. I remember when I was in management consulting in the late 90s, people were like, why dare you use an Apple computer? You got to use a PC, right? These are the best machines on the face of the earth. And Apple sort of took that in this campaign on its head, basically saying, I'm Mac, you're PC. And the way the two individuals interacted in the spot clearly showed its differentiation. Even took it down further if you think about the differences between Apple and Windows products from a customer experience, from a design perspective, from the advertising of Apple versus PC. Every facet of the marketing mix had a competitive differentiating bent to it. And clearly, as you could advance the clock down the road, Apple's been able to kill it, right? And if you look at just how ubiquitous Apple is these days relative to PCs in the marketplace, and the fact that Apple's been able to expand in so many other verticals, clearly this was one of those tipping points that enabled it to start that trajectory. Again, an example that many of you are aware of. Let's talk about another example. Again, Target and Walmart. All of us, I'm sure, shop brick and mortar retail, but if you think about it, these folks do the exact same thing. They're merchants, right? They sell goods to shoppers and consumers. But the way they go about it is fundamentally different, right? If you think of Target back in the day, people called it Target for a reason, right? It was this notion of cheap chic, going into a Target, right? Everything was clean. There wasn't a lot of clutter from an end cap or off-shelf merchandising perspective. The ads were very, sort of high-end on high-end paper, right? The whole shopping experience was much more pleasant when you juxtaposed it towards Walmart, which clearly Walmart was all about being the lowest price competitor. And you went into a Walmart, right? A lot of times the floors are dirty. It's really crowded. There's a lot of clutter there. The shelves are really tall and you can't see stuff, but clearly you get a different type of shopping experience. Expand it even further to how those companies operate. Like anyone who's ever been in meetings at Target's headquarters versus Walmart's headquarters, you get a very different view of the world. Target's headquarters, it's a chic building in downtown Minneapolis that was designed by Philippe Starck, one of the top architects in the world. Up until a couple of years ago, people at Target would wear suits and ties to every business meeting. If you did the same exact meeting in Bentonville, Arkansas at Walmart's headquarters, a totally different experience. You're sitting in a room, usually it's overheated, with a folded card table, and literally, you're 2 feet away from the person you're meeting with, and the meeting is probably more confrontational as they're trying to get you to lower your prices. Again, they're doing the same exact thing as far as what they're doing to the marketplace, which is selling merchandise, but how they go about it is totally differentiated in the marketplace. And as you can see, each has its own following. Again, another example of how competitive differentiation can come to life. Third and final example, I'm sure many of you fly or have flown recently, but I always love this example. Southwest versus American, right? Anyone who's ever read the story of Southwest Airlines, founded in 1967, if I have the year correctly, Herb Kelleher sketched the route map on a cocktail napkin where they were talking about flying from Dallas to Houston to San Antonio. And they were trying to go after the big behemoth at the time, American Airlines, right? And advance the clock over the years, Southwest built this cult following, flying point to point as opposed to flying to hubs, having economy class seating across the board versus American having first and premium economy and basic economy, and Southwest having employees that try to treat you well. Not sure if it's the case now for those who've traveled, but they built a brand that was very differentiated from American Airlines. And as you can see, advance the clock to today, Southwest is, I think, the third or the fourth largest airline in the US, right behind American Airlines. And they did it with a very differentiated product in a space where you could argue it's pretty commoditized, right? It's air transportation. It's getting your butt from point A to point B as quickly as possible. There are other factors that drove Southwest's success, right? They defined their competitive set back in 1967 as they were competing against Greyhound, not other airlines. But again, they were very choiceful as far as how they wanted to differentiate themselves versus other airlines at the time and even other airlines to this day. So at the root of it all, as we started to go through these three examples, we started to unravel two key questions. And I think these two key questions are really, really important as you're thinking about competitive differentiation. On the left-hand side, you need to ask yourself, why does the world need you? Because ultimately, what you need to articulate is how your brand is unique and special for your target audience. Put it another way, you got to mean something to someone. To give you another example, when I used to be in the consumer packaged goods world, we would try to sell new items into a Walmart or a Target. The buyer at those retailers would ask, well, why should I insert your item and take out another item that's in my shelf set? And the only way you could actually address that hurdle was by articulating why your brand was unique and special, was going to appeal to a new set of consumers that was going to come to that retailer. So that's the first question. Why does the world need you? But then the second question is, why should I believe you? Because ultimately, if you make a claim and no one believes you, sort of like a house of cards. And so at the end of the day, you need to answer both, and answer both very succinctly, because if you're able to do this, a lot of the marketing that happens after the fact becomes execution. But it's all rooted in a very strong foundation, which wrestles up to these two fundamental questions. So again, just a quick overview as far as why this is important. So the question is, how do you assess it, right? Because a lot of folks are like, okay, I understand the role of being different, but how do I get a sense of how do I stack up versus competitors today? A couple ways of thinking about it from a top line perspective. You can do what's called a competitive audit. And we'll just talk about some tips and techniques for that. You can go back to your 4 Ps, 4 Cs, and SWOT analysis that you probably have learned back in university or in business school, or just reading the business press. And then the third one is just taking stock of what your customers want, and then understanding how do you stack up against that. So let's talk about each in a little bit more detail. And really, at the end of the day, when you do this audit, or when you assess yourself versus competitors, you want to understand how you stack up versus competitors. And so one way of doing it is a competitive audit, as I talked about earlier. And this is an example that we did recently for a client in a particular industry. And this is basically taking a look at every competitor's website in this particular marketplace. And it's amazing when you look at competitive websites or competitive marketing materials and compare it against your own, because what they talk about, how they talk about it, the tonality of the language that they use, the imagery, how things are laid out can tell you a lot about how they view the market that we're competing in. And as you can see here, IPEX, JM Eagle, Sanderson Pipe, Charlotte Pipe, they all compete in the piping arena, but you can see each of these 4 brings a different character into the mix. And being able to understand that allows you to get a sense of, all right, here's how some of these brands are playing. You can then ask yourself, how do I? Am I similar? Am I different? Am I relatively the same? You can get a sense of the differentiation of you versus some of these competitors by just looking at different websites and different marketing materials. Put another way, this is another example. This is an example that we did for a client recently where they had us look at pricing. And so we looked at competitive pricing models for this particular marketplace. And it's amazing what you can find just by doing some pick and shovel work. Again, you start to get a sense of, pricing for this particular software package in this instance versus some other competitors in the space. And again, start to understand, how do you stack up versus competitors? Because again, price, like any other marketing tactic, is a signal of how a brand wants to position itself. Again, this can give you a lot of insight as far as how you stack up vis-a-vis your competitors. Third piece, right, is going to what we talked about earlier, the 4 Ps, the 4 Cs, and the SWOT. Again, going back to definitions, a 4 Ps view of the world is an internally facing view of the brand, focusing on the product, the pricing, the placement, and the promotion of the brand. 4 Cs takes more of an external view. So you want to look at the category, the company, your customers, and your competitors. Again, combining the two together, you can then start to summarize that into a SWOT analysis. Strengths, weaknesses, which are more internally focused, versus opportunities and threats, which are more externally focused. looking at all these three things together, you can start to get a really clear picture on how you stack up versus competitors and potential areas of opportunity for you to take advantage of competitive white space. So then, we also want to ask ourselves, what do customers want? And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a list that starts to represent some food for thought. And so by answering these questions, you can start to paint a even clearer picture on how you differentiate yourselves versus competitors, but through the lens of how customers view, shop, purchase, specify the services and products that you bring to bear. So for example, you could ask yourself, what triggers a customer to call you? Or in parentheses, your competitors. When a customer contacts you, what do they want? When you win a project, why did they select you? And then flip it on its head. When you lose a project, why did a customer go with someone else? What are the top three things that drive a customer to selecting you or a competitor? Or what are the barriers to adopting your brand? Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it starts to give you some food for thought as you think about competitive differentiation. And so to wrap it all up, the question is, how do you apply these insights? And for me, I'm a firm believer of going back to basics. And if you're going back to basics, the three critical elements where this starts to helicopter up towards. First is what we like to call the single-minded proposition. Second are reasons to believe. And third is the brand characters. So we'll talk about each of these three things in a little bit of detail. So you think about the single-minded proposition and reason to believe. If you look at any marketing strategy, you have to basically fill in the blanks. So a single-minded proposition basically says, because we or your brand or service give or provide something, you, the customer, get A, B, C, or D. It's an articulation of what makes your brand unique and special. And then the reasons to believe are the supporting statements that allow you to believe the single-minded proposition to be true. Answer those two things or fill in those two blanks and pressure test it against your audit of competition. You can start to see how you stack up in a very demonstrable way, because if you have something that's very unique and differentiated versus competitors in your market, literally filling this slide will give you the building blocks towards developing great messaging and great marketing campaigns. Because you could literally take this to an advertising agency and they could translate this into compelling creative coupled with the brand character. And the brand character are words that you would describe your brand. Going back to the example earlier, and I'm just going to literally go back to what we were talking about here. All right, going back to the example earlier, Mac versus PC, right? Two different brand characters about how they go to market. Target versus Walmart, right? Two different brand characters about how they go to market, supported by two different single-minded propositions and reasons to believe. The same holds true for Southwest versus American Airlines. So if you do all these things together, ultimately, you have a toolkit and an approach that allows you to start differentiating yourselves from competition. So to recap, like I said, we were going to keep this short and then have time for Q&A. Talked about why this is important, because it helps you answer where to play, how to win, and your right to win. Then we talked about how to assess, right? We spent a couple minutes talking about the competitive audit, 4 Ps, 4 Cs, and the SWOT, and then some questions that you can ask yourself about what your customers want, and then how to apply the insights, right? We talked about the single-minded proposition, reasons to believe, and the brand character. And defining these three things enables you to create a creative brief, which then allows you to engage with any marketing services firm to create compelling advertising that actually changes your audience's behavior in the right direction. So with that, if there are any questions, happy to have a conversation, Aaron or Nancy. But with before we get started, I just want to say thank you to the folks who are listening either today or on down the road on the video or the replay. Always appreciate the opportunity to talk to the EEBA group. I think it's a wonderful organization, and again, open up the floor to any questions or whatnot. So I'm going to stop sharing in the meantime.
Sure.
And we'll go from there.
I guess, David, the big question would be, why do builders need to be thinking about competitive differentiation in their markets?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's funny. This is a question that a builder actually asked me earlier this year. And I'll answer the question through an example. So this builder was in multiple states, but they were trying to expand into another state. And when we asked them the question, like, why does the world need your company? He started to talk about his story and the things that made this firm differentiated. And one of the things that this firm did differently than any other firm in the market that they were trying to enter was this notion of white glove and concierge level service. They were talking about how this builder would build projects or build additions for their clients, and the clients trusted them so much that they would literally leave them the keys to the house, and the clients would go on vacation in Europe for 3 months, knowing that this builder would do everything right. And by the time they came back, everything would be delivered up to snuff. And when we started to look at how these folks talked about and went to market as a firm versus the competitive set in that particular market, they had something. There was no other firm that was talking about the way they were. They had the certifications to back it up. And we said, you know what? You're sitting on a gold mine as far as establishing a clear positioning in the marketplace that is clearly differentiated given what your consumers want in the marketplace. And since that point, they've literally gone to market, honing in on some of those tactics, and have started to establish themselves in a very differentiated way. Put it another way, your average homeowner thinks of your average builder as chucking a truck. Mm-hmm. And so how do you evolve from that consumer notion into something that allows you to be differentiated and charge premium pricing? Because if they think that every builder is the same, what is the consumer going to revert back to? They're going to revert back to price. Right. And that's why competitive differentiation is important.
Yeah. David, is there a certain size or scope that you need to be as a builder to consider working with an ad agency?
It's an interesting question. I think the answer, it depends. Honestly, I think you need to ask yourself the question, do you have the skills and capabilities to do all the nuts and bolts, right? To develop the strategies and then execute it. If you have the skills and capabilities in the building, great. Leverage those resources, right? Have at it, because at the end of the day, we're all entrepreneurs trying to build businesses. But in the case where you then need assistance, either you want to outsource all the marketing capabilities to an agency, or if you want to get help with specific assignments, sure, you then have to ask yourself, what does that look like? And I think the best way to engage with an agency is by asking yourself, what's the objective? What are you trying to achieve by engaging with an agency? And then starting to put together parameters and what we like to call an agency brief that basically outlines, here's what you're all about, here's what you're trying to achieve, here's the current situation, here's sort of the ballpark budget, here's what we're talking about, and lay that out on a sheet of paper. Because if you're able to get to clarity on that document and then you start to engage with an agency, more likely than not, you'll be set up for success because you already have a clear sense of what success looks like. Because ultimately, any agency out there is going to want to help you succeed. Where agency-client relationships fail is when there's lack of clarity as far as objectives, what success looks like, spending, and all that stuff. So the more that you're able to do that homework up front, the better able you're going to be able to engage with an agency. And then it doesn't matter how big or small you are as a builder, right? You can be the smallest builder, but if you know that, hey, I need help with X and I want to spend Y on it, boom, right? You can start to engage with various marketing partners of all shapes and sizes to help you achieve those goals.
Yeah. David, do you see that it is more important or less important to do competitive differentiation as builders are entering a potential soft spot or downturn?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer of market fundamentals. So whether the times are good or times are bad, you can never underestimate the power of fundamentals. And I think as we're starting to hit some rocky waters with the macroeconomic environment, I think it's more important than ever. Because honestly, going back to what I was saying before, answering the question of why does the world need you? And why should I believe you? And how do you mean something to someone? Clearly, if you're able to hone in on that, and going back to the builder example that I gave a couple minutes ago, right? That positioning in that marketplace, yeah, things are going to get rocky. But all this builder is doing is literally just honing in on that positioning as far as where they choose to play and how they choose to win and what's the right to win. And they're actually growing their business in spite of the fact that that particular market is plummeting right now because they're trying to go after the ultra premium segment of the marketplace. But because they had done their homework as far as what do we mean, how do we differentiate ourselves, they've been able to carve out a niche that no one else is able to penetrate.
Right. And David, how often do you see, it could be companies in that case, but obviously we have a lot of high performance builders in EEBA, but how often are people able to use sustainability as a differentiator or high performance as a differentiator?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because COVID has changed a lot as you think about the sustainability conversation, right? If we were having this conversation in 2019, for example, I would say it is something that allows you to establish a clear niche in the marketplace. Advance the clock to today, I could argue in many markets, or if you take the consumer's mindset in it, right? Indoor air quality, for example, high performance homes is the price of entry these days, right? And so the question really for you is, or for a high performance builder is, how do you define high performance, knowing that IAQ is in a sense the price of entry today, knowing that there are many ways to think about it, right? And you hear terms like whole health, right? Or indoor environmental quality, right? Different terms that are out there today. The question you need to ask yourself is, given your marketplace and given your target audience, where are they seeing the puck, right? Because I could argue in a place like New Jersey, where, you know, a lot of the building codes are probably more on the stringent side, you know, there's probably going to be a higher bias towards, you know, trying to define sort of the next frontier as far as sustainability and high performance versus other parts of the country where, you know what, high performance is just starting to get started, right? So I think it's going to be situational, market to market, consumer to consumer. But at the end of the day, sustainability and high performance is absolutely a differentiator. The question is to what degree you're able to, you know, leverage it as far as your positioning and your offering.
That's fantastic advice. David, did we put your email up if people want to reach out to you?
Sure, you can do it. It's really simple. It's david@ammunition.agency, or you can just hook me up on LinkedIn, David Bernardino, you know, on LinkedIn as well. So if anyone has any questions or want to nerd out on this, I love having those conversations and more than happy to, you know, have a conversation with folks that want to dig deeper.
Fantastic. And David, are you coming out to Scottsdale in September?
I'm going to try. There's a chance I may have to be in Amsterdam for a conference. So trying to figure out my travel schedule. But if I don't have to go to Amsterdam for this conference, I'll definitely try my best to make it to Scottsdale. So hopefully I'm looking forward to seeing everyone at Scottsdale for those that are going.
Yeah, we hope to see you as always. So that's fantastic.
Awesome.
I know we will have a tour. You know, it's interesting as you think about this. I think about Fulton Homes in Phoenix a lot. And they Indoor Air Plus, it was their differentiator. Healthy homes. They put $500,000 in advertising into that. And then I think their other differentiator would be their design center and the amount of upgrades that they do, right? So that's really, in obviously Phoenix, incredibly competitive market, but we'll get a chance to see some of the operations and how Fulton Homes executes that when they're out there. So that's just one example in a host of different examples. David, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks to all of you for joining the call.
Appreciate it, Aaron. Thanks, Nancy. And thanks everyone for
thank you, David.
Great. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks, David.
Be well. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks.
Yep.